Good morning. Thank you all for joining us, whether you're here with us in person, you're watching on our webcast, or you're watching on C-SPAN. I'm John Vallant, a fellow here at Brookings in the Brown Center on Education Policy. And we're here today to talk about education policy and the 2020 election. As you all know, education doesn't always grab headlines during presidential campaigns, and that is certainly the case this time around too. That being said, there are some truly consequential issues and some big policy ideas that are being talked about as part of these campaigns. And to help us make sense of what's going on, we have a wonderful group of panelists with us today. Arne Duncan served as U.S. Secretary of Education from 2009 through 2015. I believe he was the 9th secretary in the department's history. He's now a managing partner at the Emerson Collective and a non-resident senior fellow here at Brookings. Dr. John King served as U.S. Secretary of Education from 2016 through the beginning of 2017. I think he was number 10. And Dr. King is currently the president and CEO of the Education Trust. And to help guide our discussion, we have Alyson Klein, an assistant editor for Education Week. Alyson's current beat is ed tech and workforce issues, and for many years she's covered education politics and policy here in Washington and beyond. And with that, I will welcome the three of you to our stage and hand it over to Alyson.
Hi, and thanks for joining us. I'm not going to introduce these gentlemen here because they've been introduced and they obviously need no introduction. You know them well. We're going to dive right into questions. So I know you've both been following the campaign. Senator Sanders recently called for a moratorium on charter schools. I know you've both been supportive of charters. In fact, Secretary King, you were a charter principal before, during, and after your time at the U.S. Department of Education. Do you worry that the current Trump administration's embrace of choice has hurt charters among Democratic constituencies, including parents and teachers?
Yeah, well, it's not only their current policies around choice, but it's also Secretary DeVos's history around choice. I think the reality is that there are really high-performing public charters that are contributing very positively to the public education landscape. I think about the charter sector in Boston or New York. On the other hand, there are charter sectors that are quite terrible, like the charter sector in Michigan. And Secretary DeVos has a history of having been a champion of low regulation, low oversight, low accountability for charters. And so as a result, in Michigan, you have a proliferation of low-performing charters, I think something like 80% for-profit charters, schools that exist really to take advantage of communities rather than to serve communities. And that has hurt the sector. And then when you have an administration that is so hostile to civil rights and to the interests of low-income students and students of color, championing a policy, of course, that undermines confidence. People are right to be skeptical of the administration.
Yeah, just quickly add that we as Democrats shouldn't and can't blame Republicans for our policy choices and shouldn't be swayed by that.
Yeah.
And as John said so eloquently, there are obviously amazing charter schools that are transforming, students' lives, and he helped start one of them. And there are very low-performing charter schools. So I think as Democrats, as citizens, we should have a moratorium on bad schools, and we should want a lot more good schools, whatever that name may be, traditional, charter, magnet, IB. And so it's the wrong frame.
I hear that. Secretary Duncan, you've said one of your biggest regrets was not getting a big new pre-kindergarten investment over the finish line during your tenure. I know there were some smaller boosts in the Every Student Succeeds Act, but you had something much more ambitious in mind. Do you think there's been enough discussion of that issue in the Democratic primary Should the next Democratic president, whether that's in 4 years or 8 years, take up the Obama administration's proposal on this? And what were why weren't you able to get it done?
Yeah, so I always put it in both my successes category and my failures
Okay,
category.
fair.
So we got an additional $1 billion in this space to provide access for literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of additional 3 and 4 year olds across the country. Historically, our department had done almost nothing in this space. So proud about that, but would have loved to have had 10 or 20 billion dollars. And we did a race to the top competition for states to come in, and we had like 36 states apply, and we could only fund about half the first 18. And I remember one of the states that we couldn't fund to expand pre-K was Mississippi. And that governor was Governor Bryant, who's very hard conservative, and he and I, maybe agree on 10% of issues. But he was brokenhearted that we couldn't expand pre-K in Mississippi. And I was too. And I remember that phone call like yesterday. And the fact that, we know children in Mississippi are usually 48th, 49th, 50th on every indicator. And so the huge desire, the demand was there from Republicans and Democrats across the country, the fact that we couldn't get Congress to step up and do more. And I'm biased. I think if I had one additional tax dollar, one of your guys' dollars to put in education, I would put it into high quality pre-K. I just think it's an absolute game changer for kids. And Dr. James Heckman, Nobel Prize winning economist at the University of Chicago, talks about a 7-to-1 ROI. For every dollar we invest in pre-K, we get back $7. Less teenage pregnancy, less dropouts, less incarceration, more high school graduates, more people going into the workforce. And for all of our scarce tax dollars, I don't know how often we get back $7 for a dollar we put in. So that for me would be the top. The final thing I'll say, not to go on too long, is the United States ranks either 28th or 29th relative to other countries in providing access to pre-K. We should be absolutely ashamed as a country that we send so many 5-year-olds to kindergarten a year to 18 months behind. And the dirty secret in education is we often don't catch those kids up. Those young people often become our dropouts. So yes, we should debate it, we should put it out there. And this, for me, it's not a democratic principle. It's just getting our babies off to a good start in life. There's nothing Republican or Democrat about that.
And I would just add, we proposed in the Obama administration Preschool for All. It was a $75 billion cost over 10 years to give access to pre-K for low and middle income 4-year-olds. And members of Congress said that was too expensive. And then those very same members of Congress went on to vote for trillions of dollars of tax cuts for the top 1%. So this is a question of what we care about, what we're willing to invest in. We ought to invest in universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds, and we also need a huge investment in 0 to 3. We need much better access to quality childcare, particularly for low-income families and communities of color, and that is all doable in the wealthiest country that has ever existed on the face of the earth.
So speaking of money, we've seen a number of proposals to significantly ramp up the federal share of education funding, things like doubling Title I. Do you think that's the right way to go, or do you worry about more money without some additional accountability into the system?
No.
Yeah.
We always do this. Both of us are very polite. Look, I think there's an opportunity to blend or connect a significant new investment of dollars with smart policies around how we strengthen schools. We need both. And the history is that states that have done both together see the benefit. So I think about Massachusetts in 1993. They passed the Massachusetts Education Reform Act. They had a huge infusion of new dollars, particularly to their high needs communities, along with raising standards for teaching, for learning, investing in teacher professional development and strengthening teacher preparation. And they also included significant accountability measures where the state was able to take action when schools were failing. The result is that Massachusetts went from somewhere near middle of the pack to the #1 performing state. So my hope would be that a next administration would put in a very significant increase in dollars around Title I, but also pair that with intentional efforts to increase school integration, intentional efforts to make sure kids have access to diverse, quality teachers, efforts to make sure that all kids have access to a well-rounded curriculum that includes art and music and science and social studies, right? We have to think about the more dollars in conjunction with the things we know will make a difference for kids.
I think in education, so often we get into these either-or debates, and I almost always think it's both and. We need more good charters and more good traditional schools. We need more young people going to college and more young people prepared for careers. It's always both and. You can't be pro-teacher, want more money for teachers, and not be pro-teacher quality. Title I, you can't be pro more money for poor kids and not explicitly be saying you want more poor children to graduate from high school and go on to college or the world of work. And so you have to, as John said perfectly, you have to pair these things. It's both and. These values are not in conflict. In fact, they complement each other.
So on a related note, a number of candidates have said they want to use federal money, and this is a fairly new idea, to increase teachers' salaries. It's a big proposal that Senator Harris put out, for instance. At the same time, states are backing away from something that you both championed when you were in office, which is teacher evaluation, based in part on a number of factors, but one of them is student progress on test scores. Should the federal government be boosting teacher salaries if states and districts won't? Like, should the feds be on the hook for something like that? And again, should more different kinds of evaluations or more accountability play into that? Or do you guys feel like the teacher pay crisis has gotten so bad in some places that extra pay is needed kind of no matter what?
Yeah, so trying to come at this a couple of different ways. It's really broken my heart that in a number of states, North Carolina, Arizona, you can go down the list where I was trying to be honest, where you've had Republican administrations, they've really starved public education. And teacher pay is not kept up with the rate of inflation or whatever. And so I'll never forget, I met with a teacher in D.C. from North Carolina who was actually selling blood, who was selling plasma to make ends meet. And that's unconscionable. So yes, we absolutely need more money. That teachers should be paid a living wage. I always say teachers are the most altruistic people you're ever going to meet. They don't go into education to become millionaires, but they shouldn't have to take a vow of poverty either, and you want to sustain that. So yes, you need that. Again, you can't be pro-teacher and not talk about quality and not talk about how important great teachers are. I met, actually just coincidentally yesterday, from someone from the Tennessee team. In Tennessee, we saw these huge growth in NAEP and improvements. And their analysis of they did a lot of different things, but in their mind, the thing that drove their improvement the most was actually taking teacher evaluation seriously.
Yeah.
So I think we have to try and do both these things: pay teachers a living wage and evaluate. This is a little bit off topic, but Ann, the one thing, Alyson, the one thing I've thought about that would be maybe a little bit of a political compromise is that it's not just how much you pay teachers, it's their ability to make more money earlier in their career. And every teacher contract everywhere is just very slow, lane in step, and you have to stay in the system for 30, 40 years, and millennials don't want that. And I would love to see districts think about sort of two tracks. One would be more traditional lane in step if you want that, and also sort of a higher risk, high reward where a great young teacher could make $100,000 when they're 30. And some places like DC and Denver have played with that. And let me be clear, the union could negotiate both of those, so you're not diminishing anyone's power. It's just saying to teachers, young, old, veteran, new, whatever, here are two different choices for you to make, and you figure out what's best for you and your family and your current situation. And that's not even more money, it's just a different way of thinking about it. I think that would help us retain much more great young talent than we are today.
Yeah, and the thing I would add is we absolutely should be paying teachers more, and we should have a federal-state partnership that uses federal dollars to push states to invest more as well. But as we do that, two things we have to do alongside. One is we have to diversify the teaching profession. Majority of our kids in the nation's public schools are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. Only 2% of our teachers are African American men. We know that it matters for kids of color to have access to teachers of color. The evidence is African American elementary school student who has at least one African American teacher is more likely to graduate from high school, more likely to go on to college. I think it's important for white kids to see teachers and leaders of color in their schools and communities. So a smart, comprehensive strategy would include diversifying the profession. The other piece is making sure that we get the strongest teachers to the kids with the greatest needs. And so you want to have incentives that attract people to work in high needs rural and urban communities that attract people to pursue fields of study where we have huge shortages, secondary, STEM, bilingual teachers, teachers of students with disabilities, particularly at the secondary level. And you could imagine structuring a package that accomplished the goal of raising salaries and lifting all boats, but also tried to get at some of these equity challenges.
That's just a huge point. I just want to emphasize that if we think great teachers matter, and I think most of us in this room do, if we think great principals matter, there are no great schools without principals. I get the principle of local control. I totally understand that. We had lots of debates about that. But I always say we have 15,000 school districts in our country, 15,000. And I don't know of a single district in America where they systematically find, identify their best principals, their best teachers, and place them with the kids in communities who need the most help. And if we really do think that teachers matter and principals matter, that talent matters, that teachers change kids' lives, it's a little stunning to me that not one district out of 15 has taken that step that John just talked about.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, you teed up my next question very well, because desegregation obviously is an issue that has surfaced in the Democratic debates. It's something that both of you, I know, value diverse schools. In fact, we were talking about it right before we came in here. How much power did you both feel like you had as secretary to influence that discussion beyond, obviously, and I know you both did this, drawing attention to it through the bully pulpit? What do you think a new administration could do to help work through that problem?
Yeah, well, we both certainly tried to talk about the importance of it and tried to persuade communities to pay attention to the opportunities that communities have to be intentional about racial and socioeconomic integration. We also proposed to Congress, as you'll remember, a $120 million fund to support local efforts to integrate schools. And again, we heard from members of Congress, too expensive, but then they put all that money towards the tax cut for the top 1%. So that was a missed opportunity. That bill is still out there. Senator Murphy and Congresswoman Fudge have been real champions of that effort, now called the Strength and Diversity Act. That's an opportunity that a next administration would have. I also think there are ways to think about how you link other grant programs, other federal funding streams to the goal of diversity, whether it's diversity in charters and thinking about that as an area of emphasis for the charter school program, thinking about that as an area of emphasis for how people might use Title I dollars and school improvement dollars, expanding the magnet school program. There's a lot of federal levers that are available. These haven't been very much used since the early to mid 1980s. There's also, I think, a need for real civil rights enforcement from the Department of Education and from the Justice Department. We know there are districts that are doing things that intentionally exacerbate segregation, and we ought to take action on that where it violates civil rights law.
I think John actually did a much better job than I did of talking about this, of putting it at the forefront, really getting into the nuances. I do think there are absolutely federal incentives that could be put in place, but as we were talking backstage, not all of this actually takes any money. And sometimes it's as simple as redrawing school boundaries, neighborhood boundaries around schools that literally doesn't cost a penny. Now it's politically very difficult and challenging, and we live in a country where people often choose to self-segregate based on, live in places to be, have less diversity. So federal incentives help, but trying to get parents and students to understand the benefit, not for Black kids, not for Latino kids, but for all kids to being in those kind of environments, the benefits of having a diverse teacher force for all kids. There's a larger thing beyond money that sort of gets to, I think, some of the challenges that our country struggle with around race and diversity that are hard to talk about, but are absolutely coupled. You can't de-link that from this conversation that we're having.
Yeah, I hear that. So other proposals, we've seen a lot, including originally from Senator Sanders, on free college for everybody, all students. Other candidates, like former Vice President Biden, are pushing for something more limited, essentially free community college, which is something that the Obama administration, I believe during your tenure, Secretary Duncan, championed also. So what do you think the right strategy is on paying for higher ed? Should the federal government be on the hook for paying for all college for all kids, just a portion of it? Should this be for everyone or just low-income kids?
Well, I'll just say, before I did free college, I would do free pre-K.
Okay,
so
fair.
I would prioritize
All right.
there just to start.
Yeah.
Secondly, free college, again, is not even a democratic idea. The state that's probably done this the best is Tennessee, led by Governor Haslam, who's made free community colleges a hallmark there. And this is not charity, it's an investment in what he sees as his greatest resources, the human capital in his state. And I do think the K-12 model in education in America is obsolete. I do think we should move to a pre-K to 14 model. K-12 and compulsory high school drove the middle class in a booming economy for the past 100 years. I would argue that's insufficient for the next 10, let alone the next 50. Our babies have to get off to a good start. And then, as we know, getting a good job with a high school diploma is pretty hard these days. So some form of education, four-year university, two-year community college, trade, technical, vocational training, some form of higher education, learning beyond high school has to be the goal. The thing, Alyson, that troubles me in this debate, and it mirrors the teacher pay debate, is there's no talk about results and outcomes at the higher ed side and accountability. So there are a whole bunch of colleges I would love to send a whole bunch more students to, but there are a whole bunch of colleges I don't want anybody to go to. They shouldn't go there for free. They're not learning anything, and those colleges are getting rich and leaving people in a worse situation than when they started. So for me, thinking about community college, not just for 18-year-olds, but for 58-year-olds retraining and retooling coming back, and then we have to talk about results. Are people just being admitted to college, or are they actually walking across the stage at the back end with skills? Last thing I'll say on this is we tried and totally failed on this. All of our funding for higher education in America, 100% of it goes to inputs. It goes to enrollment. We don't do a penny of grants or loans or whatever for higher ed for those that are increasing graduation rates for Pell Grant recipients, the first generation college goers or whatever. So changing, again, not even more money, just changing how we fund education, just a little bit of money around outcomes, I think would see huge change, and we got zero of that done.
Yeah, I agree completely with Arne on the urgency of the completion agenda. The reality is we have a national college dropout crisis. Of every 10 white students who start a bachelor's degree program, 6 will have graduated 6 years later. Of every 10 Latino students who start a bachelor's program, 5 will have graduated 6 years later. Of every 10 African American students who start a bachelor's degree program, 4 will have graduated 6 years later. And we have colleges, community colleges around the country with graduation rates in the teens. Right? That is a problem we ought to tackle so that folks don't just start but actually finish. And that requires investment and policy change. The other observation I'd make about free college is the devil is really in the details. And as you know, looking across states, there are states that say they have free college, but what they mean by that is they put in a tiny little bit of money for middle and upper income students to get subsidies for tuition and done nothing for their low income students because they're last dollar programs and they're structured in a way that doesn't match the tuition subsidy with any further investment in the kinds of supports that low income students need. We know we have students in colleges today who are hungry, who are homeless. We should be talking about the total cost of college, not just tuition. So that those details matter. There are states that have all kinds of catches in their free college program, so that if you move to another state, then your free college tuition converts into a loan. Lots of fine print. That is a problem. So I'm glad we're having this conversation about the need to invest in public higher ed. The reality is that in probably 9 out of 10 states, they are spending less on public higher ed today than they were in 2008. So we should be talking about investment in public higher ed. We should be talking about making college accessible for everyone. But the details of the policy matter, and we have to design them in a way that is focused on equity, focused on low-income students and students of color who are most vulnerable in our current higher education system.
2 quick ads, and
Yeah.
I love hanging out with you. It gets me thinking. But what he just said, if you look at the trends, and again, look at any state over the past 10 years or 20 years, look at the percent increase or decrease going to education in general or higher ed, or look at the increase or decrease for incarceration. And I guarantee you in every single state across the country, the rate of increase in spend for incarceration is going up much faster than the investment in higher ed or in any education. And we just accept that. We don't debate that. We don't vote on that. That's just like a given. And I just think we'll lock someone up at $60,000, but debate, forever, a little more pre-K or a little more teacher pay or a little bit more higher ed. So again, I want to challenge us as voters across the political spectrum to think about that. The larger challenge I have, Alyson, of so much of this is, take free college as a prime example. Free college is a strategy. We never talk about goals. For me, what's the goal? The goal is not free college. The goal, I think, would be to lead the world in college completion. A generation ago, we led the world. If we want to keep high-wage, high-skilled jobs in America, we should try and lead the world. We were first a generation ago. It's not that we've dropped. We've flatlined. We've stagnated, and about 12 countries have passed us by. But we never sort of step back and say, to what end? A moratorium on charters, to what end? What academic dividends come from no more charters? And I would just propose a couple goals for the country that I think are nation-building goals, not left or right, Republican, Democrat. I think we should try and lead the world in access to high-quality pre-K. We were able to get high school graduation rates up to all-time highs of 84%. We were proud of that. But that's still hundreds of thousands of kids dropping out each year. I desperately wish the current administration had a goal of getting it to 90%. You'll never hear the current administration talk about better educational outcomes. I'd love to lead the world in college completion. And if we started every conversation with, here are the goals, then let's have lots of vigorous policy debate about the best way to achieve those goals, but we never come up for air. We play small ball and get caught in the weeds and don't talk about where we need to go as a country to have a thriving middle class, to break cycles of poverty, to keep good jobs in America. And we need to elevate the conversation to a different level.
I hear that. So we're not seeing a ton of talk yet in the campaign about some of the things that the Obama administration pushed really hard on, especially in its first term. And I'm thinking there are rigorous standards, including Common Core, teacher evaluation, which we've talked a little bit about, robust data systems, and fixing low-performing schools. You had a very ambitious plan for that. Do you think just enough progress was made during your tenure that there's just nowhere to go on those issues, and that's why people aren't talking about them? Or do you think the candidates are avoiding them because, you both faced, as state chief in New York, Secretary King, and you as Secretary of Education, Secretary Duncan, some serious political backlash for those issues. I know they can be tough to wrestle with. Why do you think we're not hearing about them right now?
John had an easy time in New York. He had no challenges there. Go ahead.
Well, so a couple observations. One is, I think part of why we're not hearing about standards because 40-plus states are still doing the college and career-ready standards and still doing that work. And really the challenge, state by state, is now at the level of, do they have the right curricula available to teachers, and are they doing the right work on teacher professional development? And historically, as a country, we've treated those as local control issues. I do think there are some states that are doing really smart things. I think about Louisiana, which has tied access to funding for curriculum to districts choosing curricula that are highly rated by Ed Reports as well aligned to their college and career-ready standards, and I think they're going to reap the benefits of that. There are districts around the country that are making big investments in teacher training because higher standards in math, for example, require much more understanding of the math concepts as well as how to teach them, and they're investing in that professional development. I think that's a good thing. So that issue, I think, is sort of underway, but could use probably more resources. On the data systems piece, I'm actually optimistic that if there is a Higher Education Act reauthorization in this Congress, that it will include the College Transparency Act and that we will see better post-secondary data that then can be connected to K-12 data. So I actually think that's a place where there is good progress and momentum. On the low-performing schools, and this goes to Arne's point earlier about sometimes things aren't about money, they're about political will and courage. And I do think there is a reluctance to talk about struggling schools and what it would take to improve performance in struggling schools. And I hope we hear more about that, because the reality is, in state after state, you still see very large achievement gaps for low-income students and students of color. And given that a majority of our kids are kids of color, a majority of kids in the country are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, we have no future. Our economy has no future, our democracy has no future if we don't get better at educating low-income students and students of color. So I hope there will be more conversation about that and more conversation about the federal role in leading on this. I mean, because of things that Arne really started early in the administration, we had national attention on graduation rates, national attention on dropout factories, and cut the number of high schools that would be described as dropout factories in half over the course of the administration. That's thousands upon thousands more students graduating from high school. That's powerfully important, and we need that kind of conversation, I think, amongst the candidates.
So I'll try and live up to what I said and talk about goals and not strategies, or talk about the goal and why the strategy is important. So why is it important to have high standards? We just talked about college costs, and college is too expensive. What we never talk about is the cost of remediation in college. And as a country, we spend $7 to $9 billion each year, to have college students pay college tuition to take high school classes, non-credit bearing classes. And that's all of our grants and loans, that's all of our tax money going into that, $7 to $9 billion every single year. That means that young people aren't prepared to take college level classes that are credit bearing. I learned this recently, this stunned me. The average high school GPA for a college student taking remedial classes, guess what that is? In high school, they had a 3.2. These weren't 1.3. This wasn't 1.7. They had a better than a B average in high school, and they go to college, and they don't have the skills necessary to take credit-bearing classes in college. That's not the student's fault. That's our fault as educators, that we fail to prepare them. So that's the need for high standards. Now, you didn't ask, but I'll say, so Common Core sounded like a good name at the time. We didn't anticipate Obamacare. We didn't anticipate the pushback as strong as it was to the nation's first black president. We didn't anticipate the pushback from Obamacare to Obamacore. In hindsight, we should have called it the highly uncommon core, the very unique to every single state core, the Buckeye core, the Illini core, the whatever, the Husky core. But at the end of the day, that's a branding issue.
Yeah.
What we need is to make sure that we're raising high school graduation rates, which is important. We need to make sure those high school graduates actually can go to college and take a college level class. That's the simple goal that we're trying to accomplish.
So on another topic, you both have spoken passionately about gun safety, and I know that's what you've been working on primarily since leaving the department, Secretary Duncan. Do you see that as an education issue? And do you think it will motivate young people and parents during this campaign? It's traditionally, in the past, mostly motivated folks who really don't want to see gun control to get out and vote. And do you see that starting to change?
I'll just take 1 second and say that I led the Chicago Public Schools for 7.5 years before I came to DC. Happy to talk about lots of things I'm proud of in terms of improvements, talk about that all day. But I'll say the place where I don't think I failed, where I know I failed, is we as leaders, and myself as a leader, we failed to keep our students alive. And during my 7.5 years in Chicago, on average, we had a student killed every 2 weeks due to gun violence. Never once in a school, but on the neighborhood, on the block, on the bus going home, in a living room, William, shot by an AK-47 from 100 yards away. I thought things couldn't get worse. When my family and I moved to DC, I thought Chicago was a rock bottom. For a whole host of reasons, things got a lot worse. So I often say that we're motivated by our successes, but we're haunted by our failures. And this is why this is my life's work for now, is to try and remove some of that fear and trauma and violence in Chicago that is absolutely overwhelming for kids on the South and West sides. President Obama President of the United States deals with the hardest issues on the planet. He has said publicly his hardest day in DC was the day of the Sandy Hook massacre. And he went down the next day. Vice President Biden and I went down a couple days later, and it's just, you'll never forget. You'll never forget. I will say, and I'm not proud to say this, but I will say that when I was in Chicago, what I really thought is that no one cared that black and brown kids were being killed, and it would take white kids being killed for anything to change. And then Sandy Hook happened. And no one ever in their worst nightmares imagined 20 babies and 5 teachers and a principal being slaughtered. And the fact that as a country we got nothing done, zero done in terms of gun legislation subsequent to that, actually taught me a pretty painful lesson that yes, we don't care about black and brown kids, but we also don't care enough about white kids. We don't care enough about life, that we value our guns too much. So I've been deeply pessimistic on this. The Parkland massacre changed some things. Those young people, we sent kids from Chicago down, and we had 4 kids from Chicago, our kids speak at the March for Our Lives rally. We as adults have failed on this issue. I think our young people are leading us to a very different place. So after Sandy Hook, I was extraordinarily pessimistic. I'm more optimistic now than I've ever been. Honestly, not because of anything any of us in this room are doing, but because 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds are leading us, as they have with the civil rights movement, as they have with the Vietnam War protests, and it's often young people who push societal change. So we need to get to a better place. I'll say in Chicago, I'm in schools all the time on the south and west sides, 100% of young people know someone who's been killed. And I often say, how many of you know 5, 10, 15, 20 have been killed? And usually half to a third of the hands are still up. And I've never been to an actual war zone in Iraq or Afghanistan, but our kids in places like Chicago are living in war zones, and it's entirely unacceptable. And we're making progress, we're getting better, violence is going down, but we have a lot of work to do at home.
I mean, I'm so grateful for the work that Arne is doing, and I think part of what the work that you're doing points out is that we have to have a strategy that is about having fewer guns and having fewer guns that can inflict mass casualties. And that is about changing laws. And I do think we have this moment where young people are raising their voices to try to change those laws. And we have a violence taking place in Chicago or in Baltimore that is also about all these other intersecting issues in communities. Lack of access to economic opportunity, lack of access to substance addiction treatment, history of racism, policies of mass incarceration, and all of that intersects into this toxic mix that results in communities that are awash in violence. And we have to do work on that too. So that the education dimension to this issue is both about changing gun policy, but it's also about changing our social policy and changing how we think about communities.
Just quickly for this audience, this is important. So school shootings are horrific, but to be clear, 98% of kids killed aren't killed in schools. This is not a school safety issue. This is a societal issue. And the vast, vast, vast majority of people killed are killed at the park, at the mall, at the movie theater, walking down the street. So it's related to schools, but just a little bit. To echo John's point, what I'm doing now is working with the young men who are most likely to shoot and be shot. And they have lived with trauma all their life. Many have been shot multiple times. We have one guy who's been shot 23 times. Many have done, unfortunately, their fair share of shooting. And I don't say this lightly, we don't have one bad man that we're working with. Yeah. And we're giving them an opportunity to move out of that street life and to move out of the illegal economy and give some economic opportunity and have life coaches and a bunch of trauma care. And we've had lots and lots of the guys get their high school diplomas and a bunch going to college. And I just want this audience to understand that in those situations, the men caught in that life, they're the solution. They're not the problem. We have to walk with them. We have to learn with them. But they're going to lead Chicago and Baltimore and other places to a better place. It's not me or John.
So we're winding down on our time. I've got about a few more questions. We'll try to move through them quickly. The Trump administration has talked a lot about vocational education. But Secretary Duncan, he pointed out in another recent forum, they haven't really provided new funding in this area. So I'm wondering, do you think four-year college is a must for all students? And what would you want to see this administration or another administration do to strengthen job training? I know that's something close to your heart, Secretary Duncan.
Well, I just want to be clear that the Trump administration does not want an educated citizenry. That is not in their interests. When you are an authoritarian leader, when you want to become the source of truth, when you say the media is the enemy of the people, you don't want people to be able to think for themselves. So all the things that we talk about, and John taught in the classroom, how to think critically, how to weigh arguments, The current administration has zero interest in doing that. And so they're not going to do anything. The less educated we are, the more we will follow an authoritarian leader. So I just want to be very honest and upfront about that. And for me, this election, we can debate the intricacies of education policy all day. This election is really a fight. Can we preserve our democracy? And can we remove a criminal enterprise from the White House? And so this is much, much bigger than any education policy. Does everybody have to go to a four-year university? Of course not. I do think everyone has to graduate from high school. I don't know any good jobs out there for a high school dropout. And I do think everybody has to have some form of education beyond high school. Again, four-year university, two-year community college, trade, technical, vocational training. And the last thing I'll say is that other countries track kids at 13 or 14. You are going this way, you're going this way, or frankly, you can't go this way. I reject that 100%. I just want to give kids great options and let them figure out what's their passion, what do they want to do. And then the final point is that none of us are ever going to be done learning. It's not like we can stop going to school, go get a job, and we're done. The day any of us stop learning is the day we become obsolete. So how do we teach young people to be lifelong learners? How do we all keep improving our skills in whatever we're doing? That's got to be the mentality.
Yeah. And we ought to be willing to invest in that because our future depends on it. And so we need more young people who leave high school with a plan and with a path to real economic opportunity. So I think about the P-Tech school, which both Arne and I visited and President Obama visited, partnership between IBM, City University of New York, and the New York City Department of Ed. Kids graduate with a high school diploma, associate's degree, first in line for a job at IBM. And when we made an effort to replicate P-Tech across New York State when I was at the state level, we had more demand from employers and university partners than we could meet. We used federal Perkins dollars to support that effort, and we had folks in the healthcare industry, advanced manufacturing, IT, who were eager to partner with schools so that young people would leave ready for what's next. I was just in Somerset County, Maryland, visiting a career and tech center that's newly built there, and I was struck by how motivated the kids are, the kids in the biomedical program, how excited they were about what they're learning. Like, there's huge potential in smart career and tech ed, but we have to acknowledge the risk that in some places, as Arne pointed out, career and tech ed is used as a way to track kids to less opportunity, to jobs that used to exist 20 years ago and don't exist anymore. That is a problem. So we need to invest in career and tech ed, but we also need that same accountability around the goal, and the goal has to be readiness for post-secondary success and a successful career.
Okay, one more question from me before we move into Q&A. Neither one of you has endorsed a candidate in the Democratic primary. Do you want to make some news today and tell us who you are supporting, or at least who you find intriguing?
You ready?
I'm not going to endorse a candidate, but what I will say is that in 2016, there was very little discussion about education, and I have been heartened that there have been more candidates talking more about schools and education so far, and I think that is a good sign about our direction as a country.
Okay. Peter Duncan?
Yeah, we're not going to make huge news, sorry.
All right, it's
Breaking
okay.
your heart.
I had to try.
You got to try. So two things. I'll repeat what I said, that this election will not, and honestly should not, turn on any one education policy. That I was just honest. I think this is the most consequential election of our lifetimes. I hope we're never in this position again as a country. I'm not a scared guy, and I'm scared for our country. I'm scared for our democracy. And so this is not a time to support or not support any given candidate based upon some agreement or disagreement on some education policy. We are fighting for our country, and stuff that I'll just say for myself that I took for granted my entire life, some just given truths, that has been rocked to its foundation here. And so that's what's at stake. And again, it's not left or right, Republican, Democrat. It's democracy versus not a democracy anymore. And it's that real. Having said that, in a normal election, I just wish, again, left, right, Republican, Democrat, I honestly, education should be the ultimate bipartisan, nonpartisan issue. These, again, for me, are nation-building goals. I just desperately wish we had more people go to the voting booth, mayors, governors, congressmen, presidents, voting around education. And the fact is, almost none of us do. I think I saw in the 2018 midterms, I saw some stat that 6% of people voted based upon education. So I said, I've never met a candidate who was anti-education. I've never met a candidate who didn't like photo ops and reading to kids and patting little kids on the head. But I know very few candidates who say, I want to be reelected because I'm going to raise high school graduation rates. I want to be reelected because I'm going to close achievement gaps. I want to be reelected because I'm going to fight for more pre-K. And let me be clear, I don't blame any of the politicians, I blame us as voters. And if we voted based upon these issues, we would have more candidates across the political spectrum who would be in office based on their ability to increase achievement, close those gaps, have more young people prepared for the world of work. And so that's my hope going forward.
All right, thank you. So I'm sure you all have some great questions. It looks like we've got a hand right up there. If you can tell us your name and the organization that you work with for context.
Okay, thank you. I'm Leon Peace. I'm not working with the organization, but I'm with the NAACP Parents Council in Montgomery County. My concern is that not every student comes into the classroom ready to learn. What suggestions and proposals would you have in terms of going forward as to how to assist the school system, the teacher, and working with the parent to prepare those students that do not fall within that ready to learn every day category? And by an aside is Secretary DeVos has a legislation that's apparently being looked at in Congress right now that is geared towards charter schools. Could that be tweaked to the Education Freedom Scholarship Act? Could that be tweaked to possibly give some support to those students?
Well, a couple thoughts. One is that I think the agenda, the voucher agenda of the administration is not intended to address equity goals. I think it's intended to undermine public schools. So unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot of room for a conversation around that proposal, but I do think there's much more that we could be doing to connect schools with other supports to address kids' needs. One of the things that we did in the Obama administration, we had a Promised Neighborhoods initiative. And the idea there was consistent with what Jeffrey Canada did in the Harlem Children's Zone, trying to match schools with other supports around mental health services, around parent education, starting with new parents of new babies and helping them support their kids' academic and socio-emotional development, matching schools with programs after school and in the summer, access to health care, access to dental care, access to vision care. We should remove barriers that get in the way of kids' success. And I think too often, Arne made this point earlier about false dichotomies. Right? Too often people say, well, there's nothing we could do in school because kids are poor and kids have these challenges outside of school. That can't possibly be true. Schools save lives every day. I always tell folks, both my parents passed away when I was a kid, my mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. School saved my life, right? So schools save lives and we ought to invest in schools. At the same time, when people say school's all that matters, well, that can't possibly be right either, because if kids are homeless and hungry, if kids don't have glasses to be able to see the board, of course that's going to hurt their education. So we have to not get into that kind of false debate, and we have to say, how do we connect supports in the community with schools, and how do we invest in those things? If we invest in school counselors and mental health services, we will more than save the costs later when those kids are successful instead of ending up in prison or addicted to substances or reliant on social services. So if we were smart about our investment, we would provide those supports to our kids.
I'll just tell you one quick story that after the Freddie Gray riots, we went and visited. There was one school right there in Baltimore that was beating all the odds, where results were way better than in the more affluent communities. And we went in, I sort of said, I want to go see this. So we went a couple weeks after. It was Liberty Elementary. Mr. Mako was the principal. I think he still is the principal. And they were crushing it, getting, again, outsized results. And I just want to hear why. How? What were you doing? And amazing teachers, obviously extraordinary principal, but that school had turned itself into a food bank. And that school was giving out, I think it was 16 tons of food a month. Now, I can't draw a direct line from 16 tons of food to much better results, but I know there's a direct line there. Now, that's not in any principal's job description. I don't think our schools of education are teaching principals and teachers to figure stuff out, but what he identified was a real challenge in his community. And what my mother always says, it's hard to learn when your stomach's growling. And if you start to meet kids and families where they are, whether it's food, whether it's eyeglasses, whether it's trauma support, then we can talk about all the high standards and things you want to talk about. But that's the ticket to entry. That's the foundation that John talked about, the physical, the social well-being, mental health well-being of our kids. And so schools have to do that. They have to do it with the community, not in isolation. And these things, as John said, these things are not in conflict. That's the kind of leadership our kids and our communities deserve.
Any other questions? One over there. Actually, why don't we take a few at a time, and then these gentlemen can, did you have one too, right here, and then one in the back? Okay.
Okay, so I'm Frank Ballman with NASGAP, the National Association of State Student Grant and Aid Programs. As Secretary Duncan mentioned, investing in higher education is not a partisan issue in the states. Tennessee has free college. Indiana, with Governor Daniels, had the first dollar free college program, and Governor Perry in Texas was first provide need-based aid to Dreamers, and 30-something states have outcomes-based performance funding. So my question to the two secretaries would be, as we try to reauthorize Higher Education Act, what would you see as what should be the federal-state partnership, and how do you go about accountability and metrics?
And then I think we had one here and then one in the back, and you guys can kind of decide what to address in what order.
Hi, my name is Lisa. I am an intern at Center for American Progress. I'm also a former CPS school teacher, special education teacher. I actually was in a charter school, and we were part of some of the first charter strikes in the nation last year. I just wanted to hear from you guys if there are any particular initiatives coming out to address specifically the special education teacher shortage and the funding shortages that we're facing every day in our classrooms. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I think we had one in the back.
Hi, my name's Angel, and I'm actually a student from Teachers College, Columbia University. So I have a question regarding that the college enrollment rate has dropped continuously for 8 years in the United States. And can you just make some more comments regarding that? Thank
Can you take those three in lightning round? Yeah.
You want to do higher ed and I'll do teacher shortage?
Okay.
Sure. So on higher ed, I think there's a great opportunity in the Higher Education Act reauthorization conversation to increase investment. So I'd love to see a doubling or even tripling of Pell Grants, and a massive investment in helping low-income students to not just start but finish. I'd love to see an investment in evidence-based supports. So there's a program at City University of New York called ASAP, which has been shown to double completion rates in community college through wraparound supports, better advising. That program is being replicated in Ohio, and looks like the results are going to be similarly positive. We ought to invest in evidence-based interventions like that are focused on completion. We ought to have an accountability system that looks at, are students finishing? When they finish, are they able to pay off any debt that they may have? And are they able to get good jobs? And we worked very hard on this in the administration, and the current administration has rolled back a lot of the work that we tried to do on for-profit colleges that were fleecing students and taxpayers. But we ought to have an accountability system that shuts down the bad actors. We ought to have an accountability system that includes an additional investment in the schools that serve the highest needs students, but then focuses everyone on outcomes. The last point I'd make about the Higher Ed Act, I'd love to see a very significant investment in HBCUs and MSIs. There's just no question that HBCUs and MSIs are driving access to economic mobility, access to the middle class for low-income students and students of color all over the country, and have a long tradition of doing that. I was just at University of Maryland Eastern Shore last week, and my grandmother graduated from there in 1894. So that's many generations of folks all across America whose lives have been changed by those institutions, and yet we are underinvesting in them as a country. So there's lots of opportunity around the Higher Ed Act. I do think as the population of students who are high school graduates, the population of 18-year-olds goes down, we've got to think differently about what college means and who college students are, and we've got to do a lot more to support college students who are parents. Today, a quarter of our college students are parents, and yet it's very rare to have good child care programs on higher ed campuses. We ought to have a lot more of those. We have a lot of working adults who are in college. We ought to have a lot more support for them around things like transportation and housing and food, right? So as we change how we think about who college students are, we can help the students that we have, and we can also attract other folks back in. One of the great things about the Tennessee effort is that they've expanded their College Promise program beyond just immediate high school graduates to something called Tennessee Reconnect to help working adults come back to school to finish. We should see a lot more states doing things like that.
So 2 things on teacher hiring, shortages, compensation that not everyone's going to agree with. But I just want to restate what John and I both talked about of having some incentives, pay being just a piece, but other things to have great teachers and great principals go to underserved communities. And the fact that we've been so unwilling with 15,000 school districts to step into that space. Charlotte-Mecklenburg did a little bit a while back. They would move a teacher and like 5 principals to a school. I remember talking to one principal who had been at a very high-performing school, went to a really struggling school. At the end of his career, he was going to retire. I said, "You could retire. Why do you do this?" And he said, "It's a privilege of a lifetime to have this opportunity." Yeah. And that's the mentality that we have to have in education, that it's a privilege of a lifetime to go work on a Native American reservation or in rural America or in inner city Baltimore, D.C., or Chicago. On teacher shortages, again, we pay everyone lane and step the same. And whether it's special ed, whether it's math and science, where we have areas of critical need, a piece of attracting teachers, again, just a piece, should be, I believe, additional compensation. And so those are the 2 fundamental changes I would make to paying everyone the same, would be to identify excellence, reward excellence, and encourage that excellence to work with the kids and communities who need the most help. And then when we have areas of critical need, which we know we have, special ed being right there, but math and science, actually interesting, PE sometimes, we should compensate based upon that. And our lack of creativity from the school district side is pretty stunning. And part of the problem that feeds this engine, or the engine that feeds this problem, is you don't hear any schools of education steering kids in one direction or another. They just let kids come through, and there may be lots of jobs for them, or there may be very few jobs, and they're not helping to push students in the right direction. That's morally, I think that's pretty bankrupt.
Well, on that note, that happy note, I think we're going to wrap up, and I just want to thank both of these gentlemen for their time and for sharing their expertise with us. Thank you, both of you.